Hello guys, this is your friend Naruto What If Hub 2.0 and we are back in new fanfic. What if Naruto was in Team 8? The legendary fanfic Part 4. Because they were to patrol a couple of miles within the border, Team 8 was required to set up their own camp well back from the boundary with the land of Earth. Kurenai merely shook her head when their first patrol discovered the subtle traces of Darikatsu's camp. They had claimed a small clearing within sight of the actual border. Naruto supposed the Hokage had been right, those bakas were spoiling for a fight if they did that. Naruto tried to pay close attention to how Kurenai-sensei had them do things, because there was almost always a reason behind it, like the way they randomly varied their patrol patterns to make it harder for someone to slip by them undetected. It was embarrassing, but sometimes he did have to ask her why. At least she didn't berate him for being stupid when she answered his questions. Instead, she seemed pleased that he wanted to know. Not knowing why she did this began to bother him until he finally had to ask her about that as well. Some instinct made him wait until Hinata and Shino were sparring after dinner, because he wasn't sure what the answer would be. Kurenai kept her eyes on her students as they fought. Running the patrols was helping their speed and endurance, but she said she still wanted them to train a little when they took breaks. If their bodies were too tired, she would go into what Naruto recognized as her lecture mode, and talk to them about things they needed to know. Those were usually interesting, but it was another time when she also welcomed questions. Why was this so? Anyo, sensei, Naruto said in a low voice as Hinata slapped aside Shino's punch and made a strike toward his midsection that forced him to quickly backpedal. She still wore the weights, but they were slowing her down less and less. He wondered if she even noticed this. What is it, Naruto? Kurenai replied. I've been asking a lot of questions lately, he said, but his voice trailed off. How could he say this without sounding like a baka? Yes, she said, her eyes still on the combatants. I'm glad you've been taking a more active role in learning strategy and tactics. But that's just it, Naruto said, the words tumbling out easier now. Why are you so happy that I'm asking all these questions? Almost all the teachers at the academy got mad when I asked questions. Everyone but Iruka, she asked softly. Shino used his greater reach to force Hinata to retreat again. Naruto shrugged. Iruka's different. He grew up without parents like I did, so he cuts me a break. No, Kurenai said firmly, he's not. He's doing his job properly. Evidently, he's one of the few instructors that is. Nani? Naruto asked, his eyebrows drawn together in confusion. Kurenai sighed. Naruto, why do you ask those questions? Are you seeking attention? Are you trying to delay me so I don't start talking about a new subject? Or are you simply trying to irritate me? No, sensei, Naruto said quickly, I just asked because I wanted to know. Exactly, Kurenai murmured as Hinata leapt over Shino's leg sweep. A student that actually wants to learn is a blessing to a teacher. Why should I want to discourage that? But, why didn't the instructors want? Naruto's voice trailed off. It's because of me, isn't it? He asked coldly. Not precisely, Kurenai said in a voice little more than a whisper. Naruto, I'm not going to excuse their behavior, but I think it might help you to understand. When the Kyuubi attacked, it was like a natural disaster. It was unstoppable. I was miles away from the battle and I could still feel it. More chakra and killing intent than I'd ever imagined was possible to exist. I'd never been more afraid in my life, and I imagine that was true for everyone else in Konoha. Then it was defeated, but at the cost of the Yondaime's life. It's hard to explain how much we all loved the fourth Hokage, but I think any one of us would have given their lives in his place, were it possible. But then he was gone, and so was the demon responsible for his death. Everyone was angry and grieving for the Hokage and everyone else who'd died, and there was no real outlet for that grief and rage. I know the third and fourth Hokages wanted you to be seen as the savior of the village, but I don't think it was possible, not with everyone still full of rage. Especially since there was really only one obvious outlet for that rage. Me. Naruto finished her sentence dully. After another quick exchange of blows, Hinata and Shino sprang apart, panting. It's hard to break an ingrained habit, Kurenai said, slipping into her lecture mode for a moment, but once someone does manage to see the real Naruto, they don't go back to seeing you as a demon, do they? No, they don't, Naruto said with a sigh. But I was at the academy for years, and it seems like Iruka is the only one that bothered. All of the other instructors were just trying to get back at my prisoner by making me feel stupid. As I said, I will not excuse their behavior, Kurenai agreed, but I also know that Iruka really does care about you. When he heard about the spy, he thought I'd ordered you to fight, until I explained, he looked like he wanted to kill me. Naruto was mortified that Iruka almost attacked another shinobi because of him, especially a Jonin. Oddly enough, he also felt a strange warmth to know that the man cared about him that much. G. Gomen, he choked out, apologizing. No need for apologies, Kurenai said. I'm glad to see the truth of his feelings. We had a very productive conversation, and I think I may be able to call him a friend in the future. But do you realize why my attitude toward questions may be somewhat at odds with what you have previously experienced? Naruto looked puzzled for a moment and then nodded. Because the others wanted me to stay ignorant and fail as a ninja, that was the only means they could see for getting even with the Kyuubi. That is an accurate summation, Kurenai said as Hinata landed a solid hit on Shino's shoulder, making him stumble backwards. Understanding and teasing apart the motivations of others, based upon indirect observations, is a valuable skill to cultivate for a shinobi. Even more so for a Hokage. Everything is a lesson with you, isn't it? Naruto asked, half jokingly. Of course, Kurenai replied softly as she stood up. We have a lot of ground to make up, and I am responsible for your education now. Naruto blinked as he absorbed that statement. He barely listened as Kurenai gave a detailed critique of the sparring match they'd just watched together. Ooh, things were quiet, at least at first. When Kurenai was satisfied that their stamina and chakra reserves were up to the task, they began following their patrol routes through the tree cover rather than on the ground. After mastering the water walking exercises, using chakra to keep their footing on tree branches was easy. Before the day was over, they were leaping from tree to tree, subtly boosting their leg strength with small amounts of chakra to improve their leaping distance. Even with his weights, Naruto could make a 20-meter jump from a standing start, without really straining himself. He did, however, make sure he aimed for branches that were sturdy enough to handle his extra weight. Getting dumped on his head once was enough. While this method was faster, Kurenai cautioned them to not use it in hostile territory, or when they feared they would be ambushed. It was damned hard to dodge a thrown kunai when you were in mid-leap, and landing on an explosive tag can ruin your whole day. With a little subtle begging, Naruto also persuaded Kurenai to show them some more jutsus. It had been embarrassing to admit it at first, but she also showed him why he had so many problems using the body substitution technique, Kawarimi no Jutsu. It worked sometimes, like when he ambushed Sasuke Tem, but it failed more often than not. As he suspected, he'd been throwing far too much chakra into the technique, which surprised him at first. He thought moving your body in the blink of an eye, and replacing it with a nearby object would take a lot of energy. Kurenai-sensei merely shook her head and explained that if the common shinobi technique required as much chakra as he used, it would kill anyone weaker than a Jonin who tried it. It was a little disturbing to realize just how much more chakra he had available than other, well, normal ninjas. Of course, as Kurenai pointed out, as bad as his chakra control was, he wasted so much that it wasn't that obvious. But in the same breath she promised to work with him until he was as efficient as she was. Naruto couldn't wait, he wanted to show everyone that he wasn't just empty boasts. Kurenai's repertoire of ninjutsu seemed somewhat eclectic. She seemed to know techniques from a variety of styles. Sensei reiterated her motto of, "There is no such thing as useless knowledge," when Shino asked her about it as she introduced them to a Doden jutsu. Doden. Wana, let one mold chakra to influence the ground around their target. It required you to touch the ground as you release the molded chakra. But making the earth flow up around the target's feet, slowing them down or trapping them, was really useful if used correctly. This jutsu was especially tricky for Naruto, because if he molded too much chakra into the technique, the ground would liquefy around Kurenai's feet, letting her merely step out of it. Fortunately, all the practice he'd had getting Sweden, Yushu under control paid off here, and he mastered it almost as soon as Shino and Hinata. He was a little puzzled when he finally got it right. Hinata was trying to apologize for something, but when he asked her what she did wrong, she wouldn't tell him. Remembering Kurenai's words, he just shrugged and smiled at her. Whatever you did, I'm not mad at you. You're a good person, Hinata, so I know you'd never do something to be mean. For some reason, she spun around and quickly walked away. Naruto turned to Shino with a questioning expression, but the bug user wouldn't say anything. Again, Naruto had the oddest feeling that Shino was smirking at him. He hoped Kurenai introduced a Kaiden Jutsu next, so he could, accidentally, burn the collar off of Shino's jacket. Ooh. On the second week of the patrol, Hinata's Byakugan caught traces of swift movement at the edges of her range. They changed courses to track what had to be a shinobi and followed it all the way back to the border. As quick as they were, it still crossed back over the border before they could catch it, and Kurenai called a halt when they were still several meters short of the invisible boundary. Naruto noticed they were standing near the clearing that Derakatsu's team had used as a campsite. At the other end of the clearing, on the earth side of the border, were 4 figures that seemed to be around Kurenai's height. Naruto wondered which one had violated their border to lead them here. He looked left and right, his nostrils flaring, wary of an ambush. Hinata's Byakugan were active, and some slight motion in the grass around Shino's feet meant his bugs were deploying as well. A few seemed to have taken to the air after moving well away from their host. Have we satisfied your curiosity? Kurenai called out. Somewhat, the largest of the 4 rock ninjas replied. They were all dressed in tans and neutral grays, and the lower portions of their faces were covered as well. I'm somewhat insulted that Konoha sends a group of children to match us. We are not here to contest with you, Kurenai said firmly. The Hokage does not want any more incidents along this border. Derakatsu was recalled for that reason. That's too bad, the rock leader yelled back with an evil laugh. He was fun to bait, if a bit too predictable. Naruto didn't really want to draw attention to himself, but he'd become rather warm during the extended chase through the trees. He slowly unzipped his heavy jacket so the cool morning air could cool him down. As slight as that motion was, it still drew the attention of the rock shinobi. Naruto froze as he felt sudden spikes of killing intent, radiating from across the clearing. His ears strained to catch the whispered words exchanged between the Iowa ninjas, but he could barely make out a few, such as, bastard, flash, and, yellow. It really didn't make a lot of sense to him, but he froze in place, not wanting to provoke anything more until Kurenai said the word. I see your mission is not as innocent as I would have believed, the rock leader called out as they split up and disappeared into the trees. You will not catch us unaware when you come for our blood. Back into the trees, Kurenai hissed. Naruto waited until Shino and Hinata were halfway there before he began backing out of the clearing. His senses seemed extraordinarily sharp, and he could almost hear the individual blades of grass flex under his sandals. As he slipped through the trees, Kurenai caught his eye. Her frown faded as he quickly glanced at Shino and Hinata, verifying their positions. She nodded and motioned for them to follow her. As previously arranged, Hinata sped up until she was even with Kurenai. Her Byakugan was active and checked their path for ambushes or traps. Shino trailed behind them, and Naruto was a little farther back. If any of his team were attacked, he was in a position to see it immediately and counterattack. If he was targeted, Hinata's all-around vision would let them know as well. Kurenai-sensei led them on a circuitous route, doubling back many times to check for pursuers. Nothing more dangerous than a frightened deer was found, so eventually they returned to their camp. Anyo, sensei, Hinata said as soon as they stopped. What happened back there? I'm not completely sure, Kurenai said, frowning. Their sudden aggressiveness is worrying, Shino said gravely. Naruto could only nod in agreement. I could read their lips, a little, through their masks, Hinata said, blushing. What does yellow flash mean? Kurenai stiffened at Hinata's words, and then she turned and peered closely at Naruto. I suppose, if they saw him at a distance, and no real clues for gauging his height, she murmured. She let out a sigh as all three of her genins frowned at her in confusion. All right, I think I know what that was, the Jonin said. You've all seen the carving of the fourth Hokage on the cliff overlooking Konoha, right? They nodded. Well, from a distance, Naruto bears a passing resemblance to the Yondaime, she continued. Did he have yellow hair like I do? Naruto interrupted. Yes, Kurenai replied. And because of that, and a special jutsu of his, he was often known as the Yellow Flash of Konoha. But why would Naruto's resemblance to the fourth Hokage cause such a reaction? Shino asked before Naruto could. Kurenai took a deep breath and sat down on a log they'd moved near the fire pit. Well, as you know, there was a war between Konoha and the hidden village of Stone back before you were born. She paused for a moment while they all nodded. Before becoming the Hokage, the Yondaime was a Jonin who fought in many battles. He was known for his clever plans and skillful leadership. It is suspected that the rock leaders knew of this and wanted to draw him out. Shinobi historians don't know for sure that the Iowa ninjas specifically targeted his students, but we do know that one was killed, an Uchiha named Obito. Kurenai paused, taking a deep breath. Whatever they hoped to accomplish by killing the fourth student, it did not succeed. After his remaining students returned to Konoha to recover, he returned to the battlefields and, well, by the end of the war, over half of the shinobi of Iwagakure had fallen to the Yellow Flash, and the attacks he led. Naruto felt his mouth drop open in shock. That wasn't something they'd lectured about at the academy. He killed half of the whole village. He asked in shock. The shinobi, yes. We were at war, Kurenai said gravely, and that's what happens in a war. Some people think the Sandaime is weak because he favors peace, I call them fools. Naruto shook his head. They can't really believe I'm the fourth Hokage, can they? I mean, that's crazy. Kurenai shook her head. No, those scared people often believe irrational things. But they may think you were sent specifically to intimidate or provoke them. I don't think the Hokage anticipated this reaction when he assigned us this mission. Hopefully, they will be encouraged to stay on their own side of the border for now. If they do not, I will know, Shino added. They stood there long enough for at least one of my allies to climb onto each of them. Those were female Kikai bugs, so I will quickly know if they get within scent range of one of my sentries. Very good, Shino, Kurenai said with a smile. While they initiated this encounter by crossing over into Fire Country territory, we have gained far more than they in the exchange. Naruto remembered Kurenai's words and tried to stay optimistic as he gathered wood for the cook fire. The thought of the heroic Yondaime killing people made him feel ill, but Kurenai was right, it was a war, and he supposed he didn't have much choice. And neither would he, if war broke out again. He wondered who those fools were that Kurenai had talked about, and resolved to be a little nicer to the Hokage next time he saw the old man. The blonde-haired genin went about his chores, but he would think back on this conversation many times in the years to come. Ooh, the first hint of trouble came from Hinata, whose head snapped around while they were on a routine patrol. Sensei, she hissed. Naruto, who was in the process of leaping toward the next tree, caught himself with one foot still touching bark, so he increased the chakra in that foot and awkwardly recoiled back onto the bough. Hinata was looking to the right of their current course. They are under a genjutsu, she said as she shook herself and suddenly launched forward. Naruto watched four dark objects drop toward the forest floor from where she'd been standing and knew she'd discarded her weights. Hinata. Kurenai barked, reaching toward the Hyuga genin. Naruto wanted to follow, but he knew he needed to see what was going on. Naruto Majutsu. Chakra Pulse. He growled as he hurriedly crammed chakra into his hara, and then practically hurled it in the direction Hinata had jumped. The recoil nearly blew him backward out of the tree, and the bough his feet were chakra glued to creaked alarmingly. But the ripple sped outwards, knocking a few leaves from the trees like a stiff breeze, and making several figures shimmer into view under a tree in the distance. 3 adult-sized shapes swam into view, 2 of them carrying large bundles. Naruto had no idea who these men were, or why Hinata was attacking them, but he wasn't going to let her go alone. He jumped after her, Shino and Kurenai barely a step behind. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, Naruto called out, his hands forming the familiar seal sequence as he dropped toward the men. The 3 of them were joined by a score of clones. The man on the left dropped his cloth-wrapped burden and began making seals, his fingers a blur. Kaden. Gurindo Fenikusu Kachu. He snapped, and a trio of fireballs sprang from his fingertips. They spiraled outwards, leaving trails of fire that grew ever wider as they spread. Shino and Kurenai avoided the worst of it, but the vortex of flames had been aimed directly at Naruto and his clones. Naruto threw his arms in front of his face at the last moment and tried to shift his chakra to protect his face. The heat that washed over him was intense, and he didn't need to hear the multiple pops to know his clones had been destroyed. When he broke through the funnel of fire, the cool air beyond was incredibly sweet. He dropped to the ground in a crouch as he spread his arms again. His face felt tight and hot, and the smell of scorched hair was unbelievably foul, but he was basically in one piece. Damn, Koro, you're slipping, the largest of the strangers said. I thought you were going to cook that little bastard for dinner. He was tall and heavily muscled, and wore only loose pants and heavy boots. His shaved head shone in the sunlight that filtered through the trees, and his cold black eyes gleamed like chips of obsidian. The man on the right wore a blue and black uniform that contrasted with the fire user's red and black one. He was fending off Hinata with a staff made of gleaming ice, but was having some difficulty handling the weapon while trying to juggle the large bundle he was also burdened with. Finally, he growled in exasperation and threw his bundle into the air and swung the staff at Hinata crosswise with both hands. The staff was little more than a blur, but the Hyuga was even faster as she leapt upward, grabbing onto the bundle with both hands and swinging it onto her back as their combined momentum spun her into a tree trunk. Naruto gaped as her feet found purchase on the rough bark and she ran up the trunk in a continuous motion. She angled toward a large branch and began running along the underside of it without even slowing down. Damn it, we can't let them delay us. Kill them all, the large shinobi barked. An instant later, his hand flashed upward and deflected the kunai Kurenai had thrown at his face. With pleasure, Teisho, Koro snarled, his hands flashing through seals again. Kaden. Kane Haoshaki no Jutsu. He said in a blot of flame shot from his hands toward the still smoldering Naruto. Suiten. Yushu. Naruto snapped as he ran through the seals. It was a little tricky, trying to align the condensation vortex along a vertical plane instead of a horizontal one, but he didn't have to worry so much about holding back his chakra this time. A spinning chakra vortex a foot wide opened up and the air around them became parched of moisture as a blast of water erupted like a fire hose, intercepting the flame blast. Naruto looked away, blinking rapidly, as steam blasted across the battlefield. There was a loud grunt of pain that brought a fierce grin to his lips. He hadn't missed. A flash of motion drew his eyes to the side. When Hinata reached the end of the bough, she didn't even slow down and instead launched herself toward the ground. She twisted in midair so that she absorbed the impact with her legs, cradling the bundle as she sank into a low crouch. A kunai flashed and the fabric parted to reveal a young girl, bound and gagged, with furious white eyes like Hinata's. The other bundle is Konohamaru-kun, Hinata said as she quickly cut her sister's bonds. Kurenai's eyes widened and she turned toward the package Koro had discarded, but Naruto was even faster. His fist snapped up and he struck himself a sharp blow on each shoulder, and then threw his arms forward. From under the sleeves of his jacket, his forearm weights flew forward and struck the large ninja in the face, staggering him backward. The discarded weights fell to the ground, where they embedded themselves in the soft forest loam. In a flash, Naruto was running past the leader, whose fist made a crater in the ground inches behind him. Naruto silently thanked Guy and Lee as he grabbed the other bundle and slung it toward his sensei. Kurenai caught it without missing a beat, her kunai already moving. Things were moving rapidly, too rapidly for him to keep track of. The guy with the ice staff was closing in to reclaim his prize, but Hinata stepped over her sister, leaving her a kunai to finish freeing her legs, and set herself in his path. The staff flashed forward, but this time she was ready, and shattered it with a Jiyuken strike. A sharp shard left a line of blood along her cheek and Naruto bared his teeth in a feral snarl. A ball of chakra-enhanced fire struck him in the back, knocking him to his knees as it tried to ignite the tough jacket material. Naruto somersaulted forward, feeling blisters rise on the back of his neck. He raised himself into a handstand, looking behind him. Koro was starting another set of hand seals, but a volley of kunai from Kurenai made him abort that attack and leap backwards. Naruto saw the thrown knives embed themselves up to the rings in the earth and silently reminded himself never to get his sensei mad. He flexed his arms and launched himself into the air, marveling at how much easier this was with half of his weights gone. He struck the quick release catches for the leg weights as he tumbled, and then snapped his legs out straight to launch them at the flame user. Koro jumped backward to avoid those as well, hissing in frustration. But his annoyance was brought up short when a mass of Kikai bugs swarmed up his legs and Shino's right arm wrapped around his neck, laying a kunai across the front of his throat. The fire user's eyes widened and he froze in place. Good one, Shino, Naruto crowed, then turned back toward the big guy. The leader was moving to help the ice nin with Hinata. Hey Tem, I ain't done with you. Doden. Wanna. He slapped the ground and the soil under the large man's feet writhed and flowed up over his boots. The largest ninja caught himself as he started to stumble. Then he turned toward Naruto and smiled. His skin took on a metallic sheen and his feet began to sink inches deeper into the ground. With a heave, he tore his feet free of the earth's snare and began striding toward the much smaller green-clad shinobi. Naruto. No. A shrill voice yelled. Roughened as it was from the gag and whatever else he'd been through, Naruto could still recognize Konohamaru's voice. Don't. He killed Iruka-sensei. Naruto froze in place. He couldn't move, could breathe. He didn't just hear that. He couldn't have. It was impossible. He felt the blood rushing in his ears as his fingers curled into claws. His blood was turning into fire in his veins as his mind shut down. He saw Hinata hesitate, jumping back from the ice user and turning toward him, her eyes wide. A quick jutsu from the blue-clad ninja launched a volley of ice shards at the Hyuga. Her Byakugan still active, Hinata avoided or blocked most of them, but the last one struck the side of her head. She dropped to the ground. Kurenai hands were a blur as she launched a volley of kunais. The ice nin dodged and blocked, but still ended up with one jammed into his shoulder. Kurenai charged at him, a blade in each hand. Get out of here. Run. She shouted at the children who were gingerly climbing to their feet. Konohamaru grabbed the Hyuga girl's hand and they ran into the forest. Now, the leader said as he stomped toward Naruto, beginning to pick up speed. A sudden roar of flames from behind him made Naruto turn, even as he spun away from a fist that nearly flattened him as it drove into the ground. I don't need to use seals to do this one, boy. Koro smirked as his body was wreathed in flames. There was a loud crackling sound as Shino's Kikai bugs were incinerated. Shino himself was blown backwards off his feet, his right arm a mass of flames. Naruto continued sidestepping, trying to keep both of the bastards in front of him, and led them away from Shino and Hinata. The fire user didn't seem to be that interested in Shino, because he began flicking small fireballs at Naruto, making him jump to the side as they ignited the parched grass. Shino rolled over and over in the grass, eventually smothering the flames as he rolled away from the clearing. The right sleeve of his jacket was burned away, and what Naruto could see of his arm was a mass of red that didn't look good at all. Against all reason, Shino tried to struggle to his feet, holding himself up with his good hand. The ever-present sunglasses gone, the Aburame boy locked gazes with Naruto for a moment. Then his hazel eyes rolled back into his head, he slowly toppled forward and was still. "Come on," the leader said. "Cook this little brat and then we can triple team the Jonin and get out of here. I'd like to take my time with her and the girl," the flame-wreathed ninja leered, "but it shall be as you command. Stand still, boy, and I'll make this quick." Naruto froze in place. The thought of these two hurting his sensei and Hinata finished a process that began with Konohamaru's shout, and gathered momentum as he watched Hinata and Shino fall. He felt something snap inside. "I'll kill you," he screamed and charged toward Koro, whose eyes were suddenly wide. Everything seemed to be covered by a red haze, and Naruto vaguely realized that the Kyuubi's red chakra was exploding out of his skin. He wondered if this meant the seal was breaking, but he didn't really care as long as it meant he could stop them from hurting his friends. The fire user hurled fireball after fireball at the short ninja, who suddenly didn't seem so ridiculous an opponent. The pronounced whisker marks the boy could feel etching deeper into his face probably had something to do with that, along with the pronounced canines that were starting to draw blood from his lower lip. Naruto batted the flaming missiles aside with contempt, ignoring the sting in his palms that disappeared almost as soon as it registered. As he leapt onto him, Koro finished a series of frantic seals. "Kaden! Okibi Shunetsujigoku!" He screamed as flames exploded outward from his body. Naruto crashed through the flaming shockwave, feeling it as little more than a warm breeze through the haze of rage and the red chakra that seemed to feed it. He landed on Koro and drove the shinobi to his knees as his hands locked around the bastard's throat. The man's hands tore at his wrists, but Naruto's arms could not be moved. The firestorm around them gained in strength as the man's struggles grew more frenzied. Naruto grinned, enjoying the weak man's terror, but a flash of light gray in the corner of his vision seemed to nag at something in his mind. With a wrench, Naruto turned his eyes away from the intoxicating terror in the man's eyes and looked to his left. The firestorm jutsu, heightened by mortal terror, was still expanding. Kurenai and the Ice Nin, still locked in mortal combat, were forced to move away, but the flames were also creeping toward Hinata's unconscious body. Naruto felt like he'd been dunked in ice water. His head snapped back around and he snapped the fire ninja's neck with one quick motion. He turned toward Hinata, but the metallic ninja was in his way, his face twisted into a rictus of hate. An enormous fist back and rocketed toward Naruto's face, but he simply raised one hand and caught it. The man grunted and slammed his foot into Naruto's stomach, picking him up and throwing backward into a half-burned tree trunk. "I don't know what kind of freak power you have," he snarled, "but I can turn my skin into solid steel. You have as little chance of defeating me as that stupid teacher that tried to protect those brats. I'm going to crush you, and then your leader, and then I'll kill your little friends before I collect my prize, and there is nothing you can do to stop me." Rather than standing, Naruto raised himself onto all fours, balanced on his fingertips and the balls of his feet. In a flash, he drove forward, sending gouts of churned earth flying into the air behind him. The metallic ninja laughed and launched himself forward as well, his fist poised to crush the runty brat who dared kill one of his men. There was a loud crunch as the two collided, and dust and debris filled the air around them. As it settled, one could see where a huge fist had smashed into the ground, flattening everything under it as it made a crater nearly 6 feet across. A much smaller fist could be seen protruding from the broad metallic back. Blood poured out of the wound, joining the growing pool beneath the crouching giant. Smeared with blood and dirt, Naruto levered himself out from between the dead man's arm and his legs. He'd managed to beat the punch, letting it land harmlessly behind him as he slammed his fist through the bastard's chest, but he hadn't changed back from steel with death, and he was heavy as hell. The blonde genin finally squirmed free and looked for his sensei. Ooh, the ice user, whom Kurenai recognized from the bingo book as Lisuk the Ice Knife, was surprisingly skillful with his created weapons, and they'd exchanged over a dozen blows before Kurenai was fatally distracted by the burst of killer intent radiating from her genin. Was the Kyuubi about to break free after all? Seizing his chance, the ice user bound her feet in ice. She instantly threw her kunai at him, but he'd anticipated that and ducked them easily. Another Hyoten jutsu bound her arms at her sides, rendering her helpless. But rather than immediately kill his helpless opponent, the ice nin watched in shock as the blonde brat exploded with a ferocious red chakra and killed both Koro the Flame and Kazuyo the Anvil. Turning toward the boy's jonin, and now his best ticket to getting out of this alive, he laid the point of his ice sword alongside her throat and hoarsely asked her the question burning in his mind: what the hell was that? The answer came from an unexpected direction, a whisper from behind his ear as the helpless jonin in front of him wavered and disappeared. Kyuubi no Kitsune, was all it said, sounding almost scared. It was the second to last thing he ever heard. The last was the dull scrape of sharp steel on bone as a kunai was rammed into the base of his skull. Ooh. Naruto breathed a sigh of relief as Kurenai-sensei's genjutsu wavered and faded out, and the last of the kidnappers fell like a puppet with its strings cut. As the red haze disappeared, he suddenly felt horribly tired and sore. After a moment, it was all he could do to stay on his feet. Naruto? Kurenai asked in a quiet voice. Hi, sensei, he answered. Something weird happened. I think it started to get out or something. He shuddered violently. If Kyuubi was in danger of breaking out, he jumped when Kurenai put her hand on his shoulder. Why was she willing to stand so close to him? Kurenai looked him in the eyes as she slowed her breathing and seemed to gather her thoughts. Naruto, she began, from what the Hokage told me, your seal was designed to let some of Kyuubi's chakra filter out into your own. Apparently you drew on that when you became afraid. Naruto nodded, not bothering to correct her. He hadn't been afraid, he'd been furious. If I'm not going to go insane and kill everyone, can we check on Hinata and Shino? I'll take care of that, Kurenai said as she knelt down next to Hinata. Can you track down Sarutobi Konohamaru and Hyuga Hanabi? Naruto nodded and took a deep breath. Konohamaru, he yelled. Yeah, a voice echoed from the trees nearby. Naruto shrugged at Kurenai who had turned toward him, scowling. He never does what he's told to do, Naruto explained. All right, Kurenai said. If you know him, reassure him that everything is all right, and keep an eye on Hinata. I think she's just stunned, and I need to see to Shino. Naruto nodded and slumped down next to his teammate. He was worried about Shino's arm, but Hinata looked so still, lying there like that. Naruto, Konohamaru whispered. Naruto looked up, but he couldn't immediately see the little brat. Maybe he wasn't so bad at the camouflaging art when it was for real. It's safe to come out, Naruto said wearily. We got them. We got them all. They won't be hurting anyone ever again. He tried to push Iruka-sensei out of his mind, but it wouldn't cooperate. He'd never get to treat him to ramen like he promised himself he would, damn it. The bushes to his left stirred and Konohamaru cautiously stepped back into the clearing, still leading the little girl who must be Hinata's sister. The white-eyed girl looked at Hinata's unconscious form with a curious lack of interest. She'll be okay, Naruto reassured her, she just got hit on the head. I'm not surprised she was defeated, the girl said in a clear voice. Her accent was cultured like Hinata's, but the coldness of her words made Naruto scowl. She was not defeated, Naruto snarled, angrily biting off each word. She charged in there and rescued you, achieving her objective. The ninjas that kidnapped you are dead and we're all alive. We won. Konohamaru glanced uneasily from his rival to his fellow kidnapping victim. Ah, that's good, Naruto-san. I'm glad Kurenai-sama was able to defeat them. Naruto sat for a moment, looking down at Hinata. What happened to Iruka-sensei? He asked quietly. Konohamaru looked down. After a moment he sniffed loudly. I'm sorry, Naruto. They grabbed me at recess, but I saw them at the last moment and called out. Sensei tried to stop them, but the big one hit him so hard, I heard his bones break. But Sensei kept trying to get up again. Naruto closed his eyes, remembering how Iruka fought so hard to save him from Mizuki. That sounds just like him. The big one kept hitting him until he stopped moving. I was tied up and couldn't do anything, but they made me watch before they put me in the sack. Sensei W wasn't breathing, the boy sobbed. He should have been stronger if he was going to interfere, the girl snapped. If he'd been properly trained, he would have stopped them and they wouldn't have gotten away with either of us. You shut your mouth. Konohamaru shouted at the younger girl, making her flinch back like she'd been slapped. Her face went red and her eyes narrowed. How dare you? Do you know who I am? The girl snarled. He's the Hokage's grandson, so I believe he outranks you, Naruto snapped, not even counting the fact that you are an awful brat. I can't believe you are Hinata's sister, or that she'd even bother to try and rescue you. His revulsion and grief at what had happened was rapidly turning into anger, and this spoiled brat who badmouthed Hinata and Iruka-sensei was really asking for it. He swallowed his anger with great difficulty and looked down at Hinata. Her breathing was slow and even. Concentrating on that seemed to calm him. He failed to protect his teammates, but at least none of them had died. Shino might be badly hurt though. As his stomach twisted with worry, he heard footsteps approaching. Naruto silently rolled to his feet, bringing his hands up in a taijutsu stance. Konohamaru inhaled sharply, staring at Naruto's right arm. Previously concealed behind the genin's torso, it was coated with drying blood up to the shoulder. Naruto wearily released his breath and nearly dropped to his knees when Kurenai helped Shino limp into the clearing. There were bandages wrapped around his right forearm, and the sleeve of his red shirt was scorched and seared where it protruded from the right armhole of his jacket. Naruto blinked. Seeing that unexpectedly bright red shirt at a distance, he'd thought Shino's arm had been burned far worse than it was. He felt a small smile tug at his mouth, the first since they'd left for patrol that morning. Hinata stirred at last, rolling onto her side and clutching her head. Naruto carefully pulled a cloth from his belt with his left hand, wetted it down with his canteen, and wiped at the clotted blood along Hinata's hairline. His teammate's eyes shot open and she winced in pain. It's all right, Hinata, Naruto said. We got them. Your sister and Konohamaru are safe. Hinata seemed to relax slightly at this news. My name is Hanabi, the younger girl snapped irritably. Your name will be Face in Mud if you don't shut up, Naruto replied with a glare. It's all right, Naruto, Hinata said quietly. Hanabi, were you injured? No thanks to you. Father will be furious when he finds out you were the first to fall. Naruto thought the girl derived some weird sort of satisfaction from this pronouncement. Hinata sat up quickly, and Naruto noticed she bit her lower lip and shut her eyes for a moment. He glared at Hanabi, but the girl didn't comment. What the hell was going on with these two? Hinata slowly climbed to her feet. Naruto thought she was barely keeping her balance, but some impulse kept him from reaching out to steady her. If you are unhurt, we should probably return to our camp to regroup, she said. That might be a good idea, Kurenai said, glancing over at Naruto. But we should moderate our pace for our guests. They set out for their camp, walking slowly along the forest floor. After a few minutes, Naruto felt his energy returning and he no longer had to concentrate to avoid stumbling. Of course, putting his weights back on didn't help the situation. Shino was right in front of him, along with the two young children, both of whom seemed to be a little afraid of the quiet bug nin. Hinata was in the lead with Kurenai. Hinata, Kurenai said, her voice carrying through the still air. I understand that you were concerned about rescuing your sister, but do you think it might have been better if we devised a plan before attacking the kidnappers? Gomen, sensei, Hinata said, ducking her head apologetically. I would have preferred to have done that, she continued, her voice clearer than it usually was when she was embarrassed and apologizing. But there wasn't time. As fast as they were moving, if we didn't immediately intercept them, they might have outrun us to the border with Earth Country. I see, Kurenai said thoughtfully. I agree with your reasoning, Hinata. Your decisive action not only saved 2 lives, but it also prevented a diplomatic incident, if not a war. Hanabi let out a snort. Konohamaru shushed her, glancing worriedly back at Naruto. Naruto didn't say anything, but he could feel his upper lip curling. Hinata really had saved their butts, so why was her sister being such a brat about it? Ooh. The sun was setting and Naruto was very happy when they reached the camp so he could sit down for a moment, even if Hanabi didn't seem to think much of it. Konohamaru, on the other hand, thought it was really neat. Naruto knew he was training to become a ninja of the leaf. Maybe this was a preview of what he might be doing in a few years when he'd have missions of his own. On the other hand, there was no telling what Hanabi's problem was. After a moment, he rose to his feet and made his way to the nearby stream. The blood came off his hand fairly easily, as did the bloody mud that stuck to his pants. But the blood in his jacket had soaked in, and he really had to scrub to get it out. The heavy fabric was waterlogged before he was done. He grimaced and carried the folded jacket back to the tents, planning to dry it by the fire. The evening air was cool on his skin, and the breeze ruffled his black t-shirt as he walked toward the fire. Konohamaru looked up and peered at him curiously. What's that, Naruto-san? He asked, pointing at Naruto's wrist. Naruto peered down at the rounded bracer of leather and metal. Ah, that's my wrist weight. It helps me increase my speed and strength. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Hinata look up suddenly, her expression chagrined. Kurenai wordlessly reached into her bag and handed Hinata her weights. Hinata accepted them with a blush. Hanabi peered at him curiously. What's the point of slowing yourself down with those? She hadn't noticed Hinata, for which Naruto was quietly grateful, so he answered her question, ignoring the tone. If I wear these all the time, my muscles get used to moving with the extra burden, then when I really need it, I get rid of the weights and I move that much faster. Wearing these when you train is also good for building up your endurance. You spar with weights on? Konohamaru asked, eyes wide. Yeah, Naruto said. I learned about them sparring with an older shinobi named Rock Lee. Hanabi let out a laugh. I know him. He's that loud crazy baka that Neji ni-san is saddled with on his team. I wouldn't do anything he told me to do. It was Guy-sensei's idea, Naruto said coldly, who is Lee's sensei and must therefore be this Neji's Jonin sensei as well. Why don't you ask your Neji ni-san if his sensei is a fool? That man knows more about taijutsu than almost anyone I can think of. Naruto. A loud voice cried out, making him cringe reflexively. It warms my heart to hear you defend my teachings. You have truly not forgotten the fire of youth. Guy. Naruto gasped. Yush. Sensei. Lee. Naruto said, rubbing at his eyes. Guy and Lee leapt into the clearing, obviously practicing their dynamic entry jutsu. They were followed, less dramatically, by several Anbu in their distinctive animal masks, a large, rough-looking woman with red marks on her face and shaggy hair, a huge black dog, a man with long hair and white eyes, and a tall man with sunglasses and a large concealing full-length coat that had to be related to Shino. Tenten and a boy with the distinctive Hyuga eyes rounded out the crowd. Hanabi immediately ran toward the white-eyed man in long, flowing white robes. She quickly bowed before him and he nodded his acknowledgement. Hinata shakily rose from her seat and presented herself similarly, but her bow did not receive any acknowledgement. The tall woman grunted and scratched the black dog's ears. I told you the kids had been released, she grumbled. Their scent trails held no hints of duress, and Kuromaru can always tell the difference. I am surprised that those 3 were bested by a team of mere genin, the white-eyed man said. It would be more likely that they had their prize stolen by Iwa Nin taking advantage of the Hokage's laxness. Naruto scowled at that. Their counterparts across the border only tried something once, well, that they knew of. Still, they didn't seem eager to test them after that first confrontation. However unlikely it may seem, Hiyashi-sama, the man wearing sunglasses, replied in an urbane tone, it would appear that those 3 missing nins were, in fact, defeated by a genin team. The man turned toward Shino. To what extent were you injured? I sustained first-degree burns to my right forearm, with some second-degree tissue damage in one spot on the top of my wrist, along with mild smoke inhalation, Shino replied in a curiously detached voice. But then he frowned enough for his eyebrows to become visible. Unfortunately, I was surprised by a seal-less fire jutsu and sustained significant losses to my colony. I estimate my Kikai jutsu capacity has been decreased by 60%. The older man nodded slowly. It was fortunate that you had not committed more of your reserves. However, when you accompany us back to Konoha, you can bind more to your queen to restore your colony. But Shino shook his head. Unfortunately, our relief is not due for another 3 days. The large woman let out a loud bark of laughter. I think the Anbu can cover for you for a couple of days. Your team looks like it went through a meat grinder, you most of all. Anyo, Hinata said hesitantly, drawing annoyed glares from the 2 Hyuga men that made her falter for a moment. The Hokage ordered us to stay here until we received a specific written message, she continued quickly, ducking her head. Naruto blinked. He was honestly surprised that she'd managed to get that out, not to mention a little proud of his shy teammate. Hinata's right, he said loudly, drawing the attention of the angry Hyugas. Not that he cared, they were probably idiots like Hanabi, anyway. Guy-sensei frowned. Kurenai? He asked. My genin have accurately summarized our orders, she said, and the pride in her voice was unmistakable. We would be failing to complete our assigned mission if we left the border now, unless you have specific orders from the Hokage. Are you openly defying my authority? The elder Hyuga asked in a dangerous tone. Kurenai lifted her chin. Not at all, she said coolly. But our orders came from the Hokage, and only he may countermand them. You, Hiyashi-sama, are not part of that chain of command. No one wishes to usurp your mission, Kurenai-san, Shino's father said quickly, cutting off Hiyashi and earning a glare of his own. We merely thought your team was not in a condition to complete it. Your concern is appreciated, Kurenai replied politely, but Hinata and Naruto are basically uninjured, and Shino's mobility is unimpaired. Additionally, the rock ninja appear to be less than eager to test our defenses. Were they scared off when we all arrived, sensei? Lee asked Guy. No, Shino answered, shaking his head, they think Naruto is the 4th Hokage and are therefore terrified of him. Naruto wanted to sink into the earth, without using a Doden jutsu, as the adults all turned toward him in shock. One of the Anbu snorted behind his mask. Naruto supposed Shino was getting payback for all the times he'd knocked him around during their latest sparring sessions. Hey, they were standing a long distance away. He grumbled. A very long distance, the wild-haired woman agreed, laughing coarsely, if they though you were the Yondaime. Naruto scowled and stuck his lip out. The patient, watchful corner of his mind that Kurenai-sensei had been encouraging him to develop noted the way his antics had dispersed the tension in the air. Most of the adults were smiling slightly, except Hiyashi-tem, who was glaring at him, and the other genins looked bored. At least no one was glaring holes in Hinata, or acting like they were going to try to force them to abandon their mission. However, the older version of Shino continued after a moment, my son will still be operating with a significant handicap with his depleted Kikai swarm. My sentries are still in place, Shino replied calmly. While I may not have as much directed capacity, Naruto and Hinata's capabilities have grown well beyond my projections. They will more than offset the deficit. Naruto was a little embarrassed that Hinata puzzled out their teammates' words before he did, and was the first to turn toward Shino in mild shock. Was he actually praising their strength, in his own weird way? He found himself anticipating bragging about such an unexpected development the next time he saw Iruka-sensei, then his stomach tried to turn itself inside out and it was all he could do to control his facial expression. I am gratified that your first-hand observations have proven to be superior in terms of accuracy, Shino's father replied. However, there may be another option. I will leave one of my smaller colonies with you, and replace it when I return. Second colony, Shino said, stammering for the first time Naruto could remember. Yes, the man replied. You are due to begin hosting a second group, as you are well beyond my own projections regarding your development. I commend your sensei for her suggested training regimen. He paused to nod slightly toward Kurenai, who returned the acknowledgement, blushing slightly. We have already discussed the theory behind managing multiple queens, he continued. Just make sure their reproductive cycles do not conflict and you should do well. Thank you, Shino said as his father put a hand on his shoulder. Naruto tried not to make a face as a large number of bugs crawled out of the man's sleeve and flowed over Shino's collar. Just watching it made him itch between his shoulder blades. He knew Shino probably had him bug tagged as a precaution, he just preferred not to think about it. Naruto decided to casually look away before the compulsion to scratch became too strong. Guy-sensei caught his eye and nodded gravely. I hope you are keeping up with your training, he said. Lee has already increased his weights again. Naruto grimaced. Crap, I've sparred as much as I am able, but we've been working more on jutsus and chakra control. Guy planted his fists on his hips and struck what he probably thought was an encouraging pose. That's all right, Naruto. You can practice those while you are away. Lee and I will get you back in shape when you return. I'll also want to hear about your battle. Those missing nins were serious opponents, and I'll want to hear about your contributions to your team's victory. Naruto made a face, but nodded and quickly changed the subject. There was a question that was eating at him anyway. Do you think the, funeral will be held before we return? Guy frowned in confusion. We won't hold a funeral for those criminals, Naruto. The Anbu will retrieve their bodies for study, but they deserve no better than that for what they did. Naruto shook his head. No, I mean for Iruka-sensei, he said in little more than a whisper. His throat was trying to close for some reason. Just saying it made it all too real. Guy let out a laugh, which sparked a momentary rage in Naruto. Iruka was badly injured, but he was found in time and brought to the hospital. Before the Anbu located the kidnappers' trail, I was told that he is expected to make a full recovery. Naruto's eyes widened. Yada! He screamed as he leapt into the air, pumping his fists. All the others were staring at him, some of them with obvious distaste, but he couldn't care less. Guy, after a quick consultation with Kurenai, led his team on a quick circuit of the border zone, for practice, as Shino's father, Aburame Shibi, finalized the colony transfer to his son. Hiyashi stood at the edge of the camp, his arms folded in obvious impatience, as the rough-looking woman who'd been introduced as Inuzuka Sume, Kiba's mother, stood next to him, telling jokes to the silent Anbu. Of course, she might have received more reaction if they had been good jokes. Konohamaru joined Naruto in a relieved mixture of crying and laughter when he realized that he'd been wrong about Iruka. Hanabi looked like she was about to say something when Hinata suggested that she should report to their father. The younger girl looked sharply at her sister, her eyes widening slightly in surprise, but she didn't say anything before she stalked off. I'm glad Iruka-sensei will recover, Hinata said in a quiet voice. Yeah, Naruto said. I'm sorry I kind of went nuts when Guy told me. He scratched at the back of his head as his face colored a little. Recalling the contempt of the Hyuga's faces made him scowl. Is it a bad thing to care about people, Naruto? Hinata asked. It's not something you should be ashamed of, is it? Naruto frowned. Was she asking him or telling him? He wondered if she thought about that a lot. I don't know, Hinata. We were told in the academy that shinobi are supposed to be emotionless, but Kurenai doesn't seem to feel that way. He recalled how she encouraged him to think of his teammates as friends to be protected. Even if that was his role on Team 8, she didn't seem to just think about it in that way. That's good, too, he concluded after a moment, because I don't want to be a ninja like that, do you? Hinata smiled shyly, shaking her head as her eyes veered downward. You were worried about your sister, weren't you? He asked after a moment's thought. Konohamaru still sat off to the side, listening quietly. Hinata hesitated before nodding. When you grabbed her from that missing nin, you should have seen how you moved, Hinata. You were incredible. I was? She asked. I don't remember. I just remember being scared she would be hurt. Naruto shook his head. You grabbed her and ran up that tree so fast I could barely see you. In a flash, you had her behind Kurenai and were cutting her free. Do you think you would have done as well if you didn't care? Hinata shook her head slowly. Good, Naruto said, and if caring about people is not the regular way for shinobi, well, we'll just make our own way of the ninja, right? Hinata looked up, meeting his eyes for once. Right, she said, her normally velvet soft voice carrying a hint of steel. Naruto couldn't help but smile at her fierceness, and she immediately looked away and excused herself, saying she needed to see about dinner. He frowned at her back as she walked toward the fire. What had he said wrong now? He looked down at Konohamaru, whose face was scrunched up in a frown. I like that nindu, Naruto-san. I'm going to tell Oji-san that I want to follow that nindu as well. Naruto made a chagrined face as Konohamaru stood up and walked over to get a better look at Tsume's enormous nin dog, Kuromaru. He didn't want to think about all the trouble he would be in if people thought he'd corrupted the Hokage's grandson into following some heretical nindu. Of course, the aggravation it would give that stuck-up Arobaka, Ebisu, might be worth it. The blonde genin sighed as he stretched before leaving to gather more wood to build up the fire. Hinata was preparing most of their stored meat and dipping heavily into the rice bag, using the largest collapsible pot to boil it. He supposed she was right to do so, if she planned to feed this many people. Kurenai gave Naruto a pointed look as he returned with an armload of dead wood. She cut her eyes toward a very industrious Hinata and smiled slightly. Naruto nodded and left to get more wood. A lot more. Ooh. The campsite smelled rather appetizing when Team Guy returned. Your system of semi-random paths is very devious, Guy announced in a grand voice. It would be quite difficult for an intruder to anticipate your position at any particular time, especially if young Shino has made good use of his little friends, ha ha ha. Naruto did his best to show respect and not wince at Guy's humor. Shino and his father nodded at each other and stood up. Naruto's ears could almost make out what sounded like a faint buzzing sound coming from them, but he couldn't be sure. Hinata was setting out their entire store of eating utensils, and Tsume was eagerly walking toward the fire when Hiyashi's voice interrupted them. If the abarames are done, we should leave now, he said. Hey, she just fixed dinner for us. Tsume objected. It will soon be dark, Hiyashi said in a patronizing tone. We are very near a semi-hostile border. You may risk the Hokage's grandson if you wish, but I do not want my heir to linger here any longer than necessary. Now that the Aburame is finished with his son, I insist that she be brought back to Konoha. With a full escort. Immediately. Hiyashi-sama is within his rights to make such a demand, Shino's father said in a very bland tone. Naruto glanced at Shino out of the corner of his eye. He had some suspicions about when Shino talked like that, and they were now being confirmed. We will return now. Kurenai-san, we will report to the Hokage as soon as possible. Understand that I will advise him to recall your team immediately for a thorough debriefing. Try to record any words the kidnappers may have said or any clues as to the identity of their employers. The direction of their flight may not be a completely reliable indicator of their objectives. Kurenai nodded as the visitors all stood up. Naruto noticed Hinata hurriedly placed some of the rice balls and seasoned deer skewers into a folded cloth and quickly handed it to Tenten. The weary Kunoichi smiled and bowed to the girl, as did Lee, whose stomach let out a low growl. Naruto guessed they would be traveling fast, because the Hyuga boy, Neji, picked up Hanabi and Guy lifted a protesting Konohamaru into his arms. They leapt into the trees, surrounded by most of the Anbu squad. Shibi, Hiashi, and the rest of Team Guy followed. Sume scowled after them, but smiled when Hinata handed her another bundle of food. The Jonin playfully mussed the girl's hair as she thanked her, then she followed the others into the trees, Kuromaru loping into the woods below her. Still, when she turned back around, the blushing Hinata looked at all the remaining food she'd worked so hard to prepare and her face fell. Well, Naruto said, racking his brains for something to say to her. More for us. I'm really starving, and Shino is eating for 3 now. In all honesty, the fight had taken a lot out of him, so he joined his team at the cook fire and proceeded to stuff his face. Shino and Kurenai also seemed unusually hungry as well. In the end, his stomach hurt, a little, but there weren't any leftovers from the large meal. Hinata's eyes had gone a little wide as Naruto continued to eat the simple, but well-prepared food. When he was finally done, Naruto leaned back and patted his slightly distended stomach. He could barely move, and they'd have to hunt tomorrow, but Hinata was smiling, a little ruefully, at her teammates. That night, as Naruto struggled to find a comfortable position to sleep in, he wondered about this new ninja he and Hinata were going to follow. He'd need to think about this. A lot. Naruto did not sleep well that night. Of course, that was like saying that Uchiha Sasuke was a little stuck up, or that Sakura was slightly enamored of him. In other words, a massive understatement. He tossed and turned until dawn, sleeping fitfully for only a few minutes at a time. Each time he managed to drop off, he'd have such disturbing dreams that he'd thrash himself awake in short order, barely avoiding hitting Shino as he slept next to him. He pondered the new ninja's way he and Hinata were going to follow as he first dozed off, but then he abruptly found himself reliving that fight again. He was strangling the fire ninja, what was his name, Koro. He could still feel the man's throat under his fingers, but it was the terror that shone in his eyes that Naruto couldn't forget. The man had been afraid of him, and worse, he'd enjoyed that fear, he'd lapped it up like his landlord's cat with a saucer of milk. He'd been disappointed when the fire grew too close to Hinata and he had to break the man's neck to stop his fire jutsu. Naruto knew that a shinobi would sometimes be required to kill an enemy in order to complete his assignment. They even talked about it at the academy, and an old man from the hospital came and talked to each student privately after that lecture. Naruto grimaced. When he'd met with the man, Oji-san said before dismissing him was that he doubted Naruto would have any problems. At the time, he'd thought he'd been praised and left with a smile on his face. Now, Naruto knew the man was making an oblique reference to the Kyuubi. After all, demons enjoyed killing, didn't they? So in the depths of the night, Naruto stared up at the darkness inside the tent he shared with Shino and wondered if the villagers had been right all along. Only a monster would savor someone's fear like that. He already had the demon's red chakra running through his body, was it corrupting his mind as well? For a moment, he cursed Kurenai for teaching him to think things through, because now he could only lay there as his mind and emotions churned. It was said that power corrupts, how much more would that be true for power that flowed from a corrupted source? Inside him was the demon that wrecked Konoha and stole the life of its greatest leader. If it was corrupting him, shouldn't he try to do the honorable thing while he was still capable of feeling loyalty to Konoha? At one point, he began to think about reaching for a kunai, but then he remembered the mission they were on. Shino was still injured, and most of their group tactics depended on Naruto, as backup if nothing else. Also, if the Iowa Nins were afraid of him, they wouldn't press Team 8 for the last few days of their patrol. They needed him alive, at least until they made it back to Konoha. Then he could figure out what he needed to do. If something happened to him after they returned, the Hokage wouldn't send them on another dangerous mission until a replacement had been assigned. Maybe someone who wasn't stupid. Naruto slipped the metal ring off of his finger a couple of minutes before his alarm was due to shock him awake. He wearily climbed out of the small tent, gritty eyes blinking at the gray light of dawn. He shrugged into his jacket, trying to ignore the small flecks of dark brown amidst the green of his sleeve. He'd need to take a trip to the laundromat when they returned, or would he? Naruto shook his head. He'd been up all night thinking, but he still didn't know what to do. He gathered more wood for the fire, moving as silently as a wraith through the early morning stillness. When he returned to the camp, Kurenai-sensei was awake, sitting near the fire with a folded map in her lap. Her red eyes were expressionless as she studied him. "How did you sleep?" she asked, the concern in her voice evident, even to him. Naruto shrugged, not trusting his voice. Hinata was a little sore when she awoke. For all that, she'd slept soundly. It was hard to believe that yesterday hadn't just been some elaborate fever dream. She still couldn't recall what she'd been doing or thinking when she rescued Hanabi, but Naruto-kun said she'd been incredible. The way he'd smiled when he said that made her stomach ache a little, mainly because she knew she was making more out of it than was really there. Still, he wanted her to join him in his nindu. That had to count for something, didn't it? Maybe one day, when he became Hokage, she'd be able to teach others his ninja way. It was doubtful that she'd ever qualify for Anbu, but maybe she could become one of the chunins that guarded his office. That way she'd be able to see him almost every day. Surely he'd still have a smile for his old teammate, even after he became Hokage. She smiled at this pleasant fantasy as she sat up and stretched. She had a few bruises and some stiffness, but she should be more than able to perform her duties within the team. She carefully pulled on her sandals and slipped out of the tent. Kurenai-sensei was already awake, but Shino-kun was just emerging from the other tent. She offered to look at his arm, but he merely shook his head. "The pain is manageable, and it retains the necessary mobility. I am fine for now." Hinata nodded, and then began pouring out some rice for a quick breakfast before their next patrol. She frowned as she set the pot on the embers. "Anyo, Kurenai-sensei," she said in a quiet voice, "is Naruto still asleep?" "No, Hinata, he's been up for a while now," Kurenai said, frowning slightly. "I heard him several times in the night, so I don't think he slept very much at all." "Is it because he ate too much?" Hinata asked, feeling slightly guilty. She had a feeling he'd eaten more than he really wanted so she wouldn't feel awkward about dinner. It wasn't fair if he suffered because her father was displeased with her performance in the battle. She was growing weary of her constant failures, especially when others paid the price. "No," Kurenai said, shaking her head. Then she sighed. "He is troubled by yesterday's battle." "Why is that?" Shino asked, startling Hinata a little. He was so quiet at times that one almost forgot he was there. "He performed the best out of the three of us," he continued. Kurenai took a deep breath. Something Hinata had learned usually meant she was about to discuss something she didn't really wish to. "Naruto was forced to take a life yesterday, and I believe it was his first time." "Naruto killed one of the kidnappers." Hinata gasped. "Actually, he dispatched Koro and Kazuya both," Kurenai gently corrected her. The camp was cloaked in utter silence for a long moment. "That is impressive," Shino finally said. "Yes," Kurenai agreed, "but I think he still needs to come to terms with that. We should leave him alone while he works this out. You remember when this issue was discussed at the academy?" Both genin nodded. "Good," Kurenai continued, "then you know it will likely take a little while for Naruto to work through this. But he knows that he did what was necessary to preserve lives and ensure the successful completion of our mission. I don't think he will forget that, but if he is quiet for a while, we shouldn't make a big deal out of it, all right?" Hinata nodded along with Shino, though her stomach churned at the thought of Naruto in turmoil. Sensei was right, they just needed to leave him alone until he could work things out and recover his focus. The old man had told her that the first time was usually the hardest by far. It wasn't good to become callous toward killing, like many did, but one grew better at regaining focus afterward. Naruto worked so hard at everything he did that she had little doubt he would bounce back from this and be his normal self in no time. Unfortunately, Naruto did not return to his normally cheerful self that day. He was unusually taciturn as they ran their patrol route, responding to his teammates with little more than a grunt. Under other circumstances, Hinata might have been crushed, thinking she had angered him in some way, but he was so obviously distraught that, for once, such thoughts didn't even occur to her. After they returned to camp, Kurenai mentioned that they should probably hunt so they will have some meat for dinner. Naruto curtly said that he would see to it. He left their camp so quickly that Hinata wondered if he really just wanted an excuse to be alone. Naruto returned half an hour later, carrying an entire deer across his shoulders. He dumped it next to the fire without a word and stalked off. Hinata stared at the bloody offering. Kurenai gripped the kunai that was embedded in the animal's skull, but she could only pull it out with obvious effort. The scrape of steel on bone was very loud in the otherwise silent camp. "I will help you dress the meat, sensei," Shino said quietly, but Hinata looked up to realize that he was facing her, rather than Kurenai. As the two of them dragged the deer away from the camp to attend to this task, Hinata looked down at the gathered herbs she'd been organizing for dinner. Hyuga Hinata knew that she had many faults. She lacked confidence and the forcefulness her father said was essential for a strong leader. She was an inferior shinobi that inevitably dragged down the performance of her team, and she was indeed fortunate that they did not despise her for it. But she was not incapable of taking a hint. She followed the path Naruto had taken from the camp. While she had been trained to follow people by noticing traces of disturbed vegetation or trampled grass, this was hardly necessary. All she had to do was follow the splashing sounds. She found Naruto squatted by the small stream, scrubbing vigorously at his hands, which were already reddened from the rough treatment. He was muttering something under his breath that she couldn't quite make out, something about, over and done with. For an unhappy moment she wondered if he resented her and Shino for not doing more during the battle. Perhaps if they had, he wouldn't have been forced to kill. Her steps faltered and she almost turned around. But then she remembered that Naruto was seldom quiet when he didn't think something was fair. When they trained together, he wasn't cruel, but he also didn't mince words the few times he didn't think she was doing her best. He said he'd learned that from Guy-sensei, but after seeing the Jonin's dynamic entry technique, she wondered what else Naruto had learned. At least her confidence in Naruto kept her moving forward toward the stream bank. As she approached, the blonde Genin's head swung around so fast that Hinata flinched back in spite of herself. Naruto's scowl vanished in an instant as he looked chagrined. "Sorry," he muttered. Hinata tried not to think too hard about what she was doing. "Anyo, Naruto, you don't seem yourself today," she finally said. Hinata didn't understand how what she said could have struck a nerve, but Naruto's face immediately shut down. "Maybe because I'm not," he snapped. Hinata was glad that her feet seemed frozen in place at his obvious signs of temper. That made it easier for her to stand her ground. At the academy, the doctor who came in, he told me that the first time is usually the hardest," she said, looking downward. "Really?" Naruto asked in a darkly sarcastic tone she'd never heard him use before. "Well, he told me he didn't think I'd have any problems at all, like I'm some monster that would probably enjoy killing," he added bitterly. Hinata felt her stomach contract into a ball of ice, as much for his tone as for the words themselves. Why had the old man told Naruto such a cruel thing? The rage she'd felt burning in her heart when she faced the spy was back, blazing even hotter than before. "Did he really say that?" she asked in a quiet voice, her hands shaking as she clenched her fists as her sides. Naruto nodded wearily, his expression puzzled. "That's bullshit," she yelled at Naruto, using a word she'd picked up from him in their training sessions. Naruto flinched back like he'd been kicked, lost his balance, and fell into the stream. Hinata's hands flashed to her traitorous mouth as her eyes widened in horror. How could she have done such a thing? Splashing and sputtering, Naruto struggled to his feet, water streaming out of his uniform. Hinata felt her heart breaking as she realized what she'd done. He'd never forgive her for this. He might even ask to be transferred to another team. He'd definitely never train with her again. Hinata began trying to formulate an apology of sufficient magnitude to salvage her friendship with her teammate as he wiped at his face, spat out some muddy water, and snorted. And then he laughed. It was more of a rusty chuckle at first, but it grew smoother and louder until he was halfway bent over, holding his knees for balance and whooping like a madman at the tops of his lungs. Hinata was still frozen in place as Naruto sloshed back up onto the bank. He took off his jacket and began trying to wring it out. "And I just got this thing dry too," he muttered. That statement seemed to snap Hinata's shocked awareness back into her body again. I'm sorry, Naruto, I didn't," she tried to apologize. He waved off her apologies. "It was my own fault," he said. Then he cleared his throat and did a rough imitation of Iruka-sensei's voice. "But I am just shocked, shocked I tell you, at such coarse language." Hinata felt her face reddening. I didn't mean to. I was just," her voice trailed off and she took a steadying breath. She raised her chin and looked Naruto squarely in the face. "He had no business saying something like that to you, Naruto-kun. That is what I meant to say." Naruto looked up from plucking the soaked t-shirt away from his chest. "Maybe you were more accurate the first time," he said with a sigh. Then he peeled off the sopping wet fabric. Hinata abruptly turned and looked away. She listened to more water droplets hit the grass behind her as he slowly wrung out his shirt. He wasn't doing anything provocative, but she was still intensely uncomfortable. This made her feel faintly ridiculous, as they'd been camping along the border for weeks now. Trying to distract herself, she thought about his ominous words as she arrived. "What did you mean about not being yourself?" she asked him without thinking. Naruto did not answer at first. Worried about having given offense again, Hinata turned back around. Naruto was lost in thought, the t-shirt dangling from his fingers. He looked up at her after a moment, and then pulled it back on. "Prisons," Naruto said quietly, cutting her off. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression indecipherable. Hinata was almost afraid to breathe, wary of breaking this fey mood he'd fallen into. This was important. She knew it the same way she knew Naruto would find a way to become Hokage someday. But why was she almost shivering with fear? "They never celebrate my birthday," he said slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Why?" she asked in little more than a whisper, even as her heart wrenched with pity and that cold voice in the back of her mind told her that she didn't really want to know the answer to that question. Better to let things go on as they were. Naruto sighed. "I was born on October 10th, 12 years ago," he said. Hinata had always been the fact-checker for their group planning sessions, but everyone in Konoha knew what day that was. "That's the day the Kyuubi," her voice trailed off as her eyes went wide. Naruto looked down, but not before Hinata saw the light go right out of those bright blue orbs. The fourth Hokage couldn't kill it. No one could. So he sealed it into a newborn infant. "You," Hinata whispered. It was an effort to even move her lips, as the enormity of what she just had confirmed crashed down on her. "Yes," he said in a dead voice. "The third Hokage made a law forbidding anyone from revealing that secret except me, so you can't say anything. But our mission will be over in a few days. After that, you guys can get a new combat specialist." "Why?" she choked out. Was he angry that she'd figured out his secret? Or had she pressed him too hard for answers? She clenched her jaw to keep from crying out in dismay. Naruto shook his head like she was an annoying fly. "Why?" he asked in a puzzled voice. "Hinata, there's a demon inside of me. It almost got out when I was fighting those guys. I could have killed all of you. Did you try to let it out?" Hinata asked, trying to suppress her revulsion at what had been done to him. To be honest, there was some fear as well. Her clan had suffered heavy losses when the Kyuubi attacked, losses they had yet to recover. No, Naruto said quickly. But, when I got the drop on Koro, he swallowed thickly, strangling him, and he was terrified of me and all this red chakra that was pouring out of me. And I was enjoying his fear. He was blasting out all this fire, but it couldn't stop me. I kept squeezing until I saw the fire was about to reach you, then I broke his neck to stop it. His voice trailed off and he raised his haunted eyes to hers. Hyuga Hinata had watched Uzumaki Naruto for years before they were placed on the same team. She thought she'd seen all his moods. Happy, angry, frustrated, mischievous, but nothing like this. He looked sad and old, in a way. He seemed so lost and alone that she realized that much of what she'd admired before this day had been merely a mask. In a sense, she felt betrayed that her idol of confidence and determination had been revealed to have feet of clay. At the same time, her heart ached as she wondered how many people, if any, had ever seen this side of him. Naruto, she said gently. I don't think a demon would care if I were burned or not. But that just means that our personalities may be mixing, Naruto insisted. I care about what happens to you now, but what about next mission? Will I stop caring then and let you die? Hinata just shook her head violently, making her bangs rearrange themselves. Not you, she insisted, never. You don't understand, Naruto insisted. I was scaring him and I was enjoying it like some sick freak. Anyo, Hinata murmured as she tried to get her emotions back under control. What she'd learned was huge, but she'd have to digest that later. Naruto needed her to be calm and rational right now. Koro is the one who burned you. Naruto nodded, but didn't say any more. Did he do other things to anger you, besides hurt you and Shino? Hinata asked shrewdly. Naruto's face reddened, but he just nodded and did not otherwise answer. Naruto, the old man told me that such feelings are normal in a violent confrontation, Hinata continued in a voice that was almost serene compared to earlier. Naruto blinked. Really? Hinata nodded. So you don't think? Naruto began, but let his voice trail off as Hinata shook her head. Are you okay with this, Hinata? She looked up at the almost pleading tone in his voice. Whether it was that or the haunted look in his eyes, something gave her the courage to lean forward and put her hand on his forearm. The skin was cool and damp from his recent dunking, but it warmed rapidly under her fingertips. I would rather have you stay with Team 8, and Naruto-kun, she managed to choke out before her throat completely closed off. Naruto gazed at her with something akin to wonder in his eyes, and it thrilled her to the core that she had made that dead look go away. She had made Naruto happy again, with just a few words. She was more proud of that than any of the pitiful few triumphs of her life thus far. Thank you, Hinata-chan, Naruto said, smiling as she reddened even further. His stomach made a hollow grinding sound, so long and so prolonged that it utterly shattered the mood. Naruto ducked his head sheepishly as Hinata quickly withdrew her hand from his arm. Her hand covered her mouth, concealing a shy smile. I should be getting dinner started, she said as she gracefully rose to her feet. Naruto grabbed his jacket as he rolled to his feet. He carried the damp fabric as he followed Hinata back to the camp. We have sufficient meat to last for the remaining duration of our assignment, Shino reported as Hinata rejoined them around the smokeless fire. He was carefully unwinding the bandages on his forearm. Hinata nodded and began preparing skewers as Naruto ducked into the boy's tent. Sensei, she said quietly, and Kurenai looked up from the kunai she was sharpening. Yes, Hinata, Kurenai asked. I think you should talk to Naruto, she answered calmly, though she was still seething inside. The counselor who spoke to him at the academy gave him extremely poor advice. Why would he do that? Kurenai asked, peering intently at her. Anyo, Hinata said, her eyes flickering over at Shino for an instant. I am not permitted to say, she replied. Does this have to do with the Kyuubi? Shino asked in a perfectly normal tone of voice. Hinata froze in place. Naruto's head shot out of the tent at the word, Kyuubi. He frowned at Hinata, who began stammering denials of having broken the law as he crawled out of the tent in a pair of shorts and a dry t-shirt. I am not stupid, Naruto, Shino said evenly, turning toward the boy and beginning to tick off points on his fingers. You have a chakra capacity exceeding that of most Jonin, even thought you have just become a genin. You can master highly chakra-intensive techniques with far more ease than you can master less demanding ones, suggesting that your chakra capacity is literally filled to overflowing most of the time. Even the most forthcoming adults of Konoha are strangely unwilling to discuss the reasons why you are shunned by most. There are no physical relics from the nine-tailed fox, even though our history texts state that it was slain by the fourth Hokage. Your physical stamina is superhuman and you recover from minor injuries at a rate unprecedented for someone not under a physician's care. Your birth date is a matter of public record, as are the unusual birthmarks on your face. And finally, when we spar, I can have half my colony feed off of your chakra until they are replete and you do not even notice. He closed his hands and seemed to look Naruto squarely in the eyes. I am neither stupid nor unobservant. Hinata's mouth was hanging open, though she was relieved that Naruto knew she hadn't revealed his secret. Their sensei looked both proud and amused. The last member of their team was neither. You stuck your bugs on me when we sparred, Naruto demanded, outraged. That's cheating. I was curious as to whether your increased speed was from chakra or purely physical conditioning, Shino replied. Naruto made a face. I am so smashing them if you do that again, he threatened. It would be useless to do so, Shino replied, since you seem to have inexhaustible chakra reserves. It is also not good for the Kikai to gorge on chakra. You get fat bugs? Naruto asked, and then gave a shudder. Never mind, I don't want to know. How long have you? I have suspected for a while. Our last sparring session at the inn was the last data I needed. I finalized my conclusions and eliminated the alternative hypotheses after we established our camp here. The only possible explanation for the observed facts was that the Kyuubi had been sealed to you or merged in a similar fashion. The bug user looked down and began smearing a clear ointment on his burned wrist. Naruto came out of the tent to sit down by the fire. In his black t-shirt and dark orange shorts he looked younger, in a way. His weights were still visible on his arms and legs, but Hinata almost didn't even notice them anymore. He rubbed at his eyes and Hinata remembered Sensei saying he hadn't slept well the previous night. So Shino, do you have a problem with this? It being sealed inside me? He asked. The Hokage would not have placed you on a genin team if you were dangerous in any way, Shino responded. Our sensei is unusually solicitous of our physical safety, and she does not seem apprehensive regarding your presence. Your more unusual attributes, which I surmise are effects of the Kyuubi being sealed inside you, have proven to be an asset, both in training and during confrontations. Naruto nodded slowly at this, but Kurenai-sensei spoke up. You have spoken about the Hokage's motivations, as well as my own, Shino, she said. What are your personal observations? Shino glanced at their sensei with what Hinata might have considered annoyance, had it come from another. He paused briefly, and adjusted his glasses before speaking. Based upon my interactions, I find the reactions of the villagers to be illogical and poorly thought through. Naruto bears them far less ill will than many others would in his position, something that would be impossible if he were being influenced or possessed by a demonic entity. Also, his solicitude toward certain of his superiors and colleagues is at odds with such a negative characterization of his personality. Naruto just blinked at their teammate. He turned toward Kurenai-sensei. He's saying that you're too nice a person for him to worry about that, the Jonin said with a sigh. Oh, Naruto said. He turned back toward Shino. Why didn't you just say so? He asked. Shino did not answer, and instead began rewrapping his bandages. Hinata moved to help him, but he waved her off, proving to be surprisingly dexterous with his left hand. Hinata went back to preparing the skewers while they all sat in silence. Naruto propped up his jacket and pants to dry near the fire, flashing a grin at her embarrassment, then began feeding small twigs into the flames. Kurenai took out a kunai and began slowly filing a nick out of the blade. Hinata? Kurenai asked after a few minutes. Yes, sensei. Hinata answered as she packed fragrant herbs around the sliced fragments of meat. Another pot of rice simmered over the coals. Why did you say I needed to talk to Naruto? The Jonin asked as she tested the edge of the kunai she'd been sharpening. Hinata swallowed. She gave Naruto an apologetic glance. Sensei, I do not believe Naruto received the proper instruction at the academy. On the subject we discussed this morning. Kurenai sensei's eyes widened as she seemed to understand what Hinata was hinting at. Hinata didn't want to repeat Naruto's painful words if she could help it. The idea of anyone saying that to someone training to be a shinobi was awful, but saying it to someone like Naruto-kun was just unforgivable. Sensei seemed to share her opinion because her eyes narrowed and the air suddenly felt much colder. The three genins froze in place as the killer intent swept over them. It was fortunate that all of them knew they were not the target of this rage. Naruto, come with me, Kurenai snapped. Naruto jumped to his feet and followed their sensei out of the clearing without a word. Hinata swallowed and resumed preparing dinner, hoping that the familiar task would soothe her taut nerves. Ooh, Naruto was thoughtful as he and Kurenai returned to their camp, following the appetizing smells of Hinata's handiwork. He was a little embarrassed that he hadn't really considered that the old man might have sought to sabotage him as much as the instructors who hated him. The old man was an expert on human psychology, which was why he conducted the counseling sessions, and he'd known his own subject well enough to know how to conceal his distaste for the Kyuubi's jailer. That's what made his false advice and assessment so effective. But it didn't make Naruto feel any less stupid. Kurenai's anger had been awe-inspiring, not to mention a little frightening. When they'd withdrawn far enough from the camp for a private discussion, she made him sit on a fallen log and tell her everything that was said during the counseling session. Before he was even halfway done, she was up and pacing as he talked. When he was finished, she turned away from him for a moment. Her hands moved too quickly to see in a trio of kunai embedded in the trunk of the tree she was facing. That wasn't so unusual, but the fact that they'd penetrated halfway up the handles was. After retrieving her kunai and taking several deep breaths, Kurenai-sensei explained what he should have learned at the academy, before ever graduating, before even thinking about going on a mission. As a shinobi of the leaf, he would sometimes be placed into mortal conflicts, and inevitably would have to take a life. That was part of the job, and it didn't make him a monster to have done so. More important were the details. Was it possible for him to have avoided killing? Would avoidance have placed his teammates or his mission at risk? Or was he looking for excuses to kill? Was he antagonizing potential enemies in order to have an excuse to fight and kill them? In that context, yesterday's battle appeared quite different. The enemy had struck the first blows, attacking Iruka and kidnapping Konohamaru and the bratty Hanabi. There was no question of letting them escape with their captives, even if Hinata hadn't already engaged them. With Hinata and Shino down, he and Kurenai were outnumbered. He just wished he hadn't been quite so gleeful with Koro. Kurenai-sensei seemed to share Hinata's intuition. What did he say? She asked. When Naruto just stared at her, she continued, I was concentrating on a genjutsu, but I could hear that they were talking. I don't think you would have experienced such strong emotions in a combat situation without provocation. Guy and I both taught you better than that. Naruto was silent for a moment. The big one told Koro to cook me so they could gang up on you. Koro said he'd rather take his time with you and Hinata, he whispered as his nails dug into his palms. His hands still shook. Kurenai quickly leaned forward, grabbing his shoulder and shaking him. Naruto. What? Naruto asked, shaking his head to clear it of those memories. Try to calm down, she said. Your chakra was spiking very strongly, and I could see a faint red glow around you. As I said before, you seem to tap into its chakra when you are feeling strong negative emotions. I'm sorry, sensei, Naruto mumbled as he looked down. You were just acting in your role within the team, she finished for him. A role I set for you and a role you fulfilled beyond my expectations yesterday. But Shino and Hinata got hurt. Naruto protested. Kurenai frowned. I do not expect you to intercept every blow aimed at your teammates, Naruto. That would be an unrealistic, not to mention unfair, expectation to place upon you. I apologize if that was the impression I had given. Do you think Shino and Hinata are weak? No, sensei. Naruto said quickly. He'd wanted to smack that brat Hanabi when she said that about Hinata. Good. They are shinobi of the leaf, the same as you. Do not insult them, she replied. They know the risks the same as you. While your abilities seem to be better suited for a direct confrontation, they are not helpless. But, Naruto choked out as he struggled with his emotions. They're my friends, he said in little more than a whisper. He looked up as he felt a hand on his shoulder. Kurenai was sitting on the log again, smiling at him. Was that so hard to admit, Naruto? You care about your friends. That doesn't sound like the behavior of a demon, or a hardened killer, does it? Naruto slowly shook his head. I don't want anyone on Team 8 getting hurt, he said. Kurenai gave his shoulder a squeeze, startling him as she removed her hand. I know how you feel, she said quietly. I felt the same way about my team when I was a genin. Killing an enemy is never something to be taken lightly, but when it is done in defense of another life, no one will fault you, Naruto. But I was enjoying, Naruto protested. Their threats made you angry, didn't they? His sensei asked. Naruto took a deep breath and nodded. He didn't even want to think about that again. That person also taunted you as we fought, Kurenai added. While you did not allow him to goad you into making a mistake, it is understandable that you might feel a sense of vindication when you were finally able to come to grips with him. Does that make sense to you? I suppose, Naruto said in a dubious voice. Kurenai sighed. Given that you seem to tap into the red chakra easier when you are feeling strong emotions, there is a possibility that your prisoner will attempt to influence you at such moments. However, your behavior during that skirmish was well within the bounds of acceptable behavior for an active duty shinobi. Stay on your guard the next time this happens, and I am sure you will continue to make me proud to have you as a student. Naruto felt like he'd been clubbed. Proud, he stammered. Kurenai just stared at him incredulously. Naruto, you defended your team and defeated 2 enemies of higher rank. I am not sure I would have been able to defeat all 3 at once, so you quite possibly saved several lives yesterday. Do not let your concerns blind you to the fact that you performed your role well above my expectations. Naruto felt like an idiot, sitting there with his mouth hanging open. But he was completely numb. An hour ago, he'd been thinking about, well, never mind. Now, his sensei was telling him that what he'd done yesterday made her proud of him, and that he had done nothing he needed to worry about. It was almost too much for him to deal with. Kurenai sniffed the air. I think Hinata has dinner almost ready. We'd better get back or we'll hurt her feelings, right, Naruto? He nodded dumbly and stood up to follow his sensei back to the camp. His mind was still trying to catch up, but he knew it would. Eventually. Ooh. Shino carefully flexed his right hand, feeling the dull ache as the skin pulled taut under the bandages. The medicinal cream Hinata loaned him was surprisingly effective at dulling the pain. When he asked her where she had purchased it, she shyly admitted that she'd made it herself. He wondered how she had become so adept at medicinal preparations, but he wasn't sure he really wanted to know. While Naruto wasn't the most perceptive of shinobi, he had been able to sense that something was not right with Hinata and the other Hyugas. It was hardly his place to pry into the workings of another Konoha family, let alone a clan with the influence and secretive nature of the Hyugas. However, once Naruto had raised his suspicions, it was almost impossible for him to not pick up on any clues that presented themselves. He wondered if his teammate had done that on purpose, but that seemed unlikely. Naruto was hardly manipulative. He lacked both the awareness and the inclination to make use of others in such a way. He was, for example, still ignorant of Hinata's feelings for him, which was an impressive feat in and of itself. He might have compared the Hyuga girl's affection for Naruto to the behavior of Uchiha Sasuke's fan club, but for several key differences. Hinata's behavior was far less forward than that of the kunoichis who pursued the last Uchiha of Konoha. She funneled her energies into improving her abilities by training with the object of her affections, a far more useful activity than pointless histrionics and bickering with rivals. Not that Hinata had too many rivals, of course. And that brought him to the last major difference. Given what he had seen of Uchiha Sasuke's behavior, he seemed less than interested in any of the kunoichis chasing him. As an object of romantic attentions, he was far too self-absorbed and taciturn to make an ideal partner. Rather, they seemed to be chasing an impossibly idealized mirage they had built up in their minds and dubbed Uchiha Sasuke. They pursued the boy because they didn't really know anything about him. Hinata, on the other hand, seemed to understand Naruto better than anyone else, and it was only after being on the same team with them for months that Shino was starting to realize that. Aburame Shino had always prided himself regarding his observational skills. He liked to think that he saw things as they were, rather than letting emotions or prejudgments cloud his vision, so this was a particularly galling conclusion to reach. Nonetheless, correct behavior required that he admit his error. Hinata, he said quietly, watching her turn the fragrant skewers over the coals. Yes, Shino, she said, looking up. Do you recall our conversation at lunch the day we were assigned to Kurenai-sensei? Hinata didn't answer, but merely nodded, her eyes curious. Upon further consideration, I am forced to conclude that you were accurate in your initial assessment of Uzumaki Naruto, and I was incorrect, Shino said, trying to maintain his normal, precise diction. Hinata frowned at him, which was somewhat unexpected. Are you saying that because of what you had confirmed today? She replied, her voice somewhat sharp, which was even more surprising. Shino paused to gather his thoughts before formulating a response. Hinata's friendship with Naruto was having an even stronger effect on her personality than he expected. It would remain to be seen if this would be fortuitous or not. Not directly. However, I am beginning to realize the degree to which his learning environment was compromised by the rancor of the adults at the Konoha Ninja Academy. It was the subtle discouragement and negative feedback he received from the instructors that retarded his development, not a lack of focus or an unwillingness to apply himself. Observing his progress after he began working with Jonins like Kurenai-sensei and Maeda Guy has given me a much more accurate conception of his work ethic and overall capabilities. This has, in turn, drawn me to new conclusions. Hinata's pupil-less eyes seemed to look right through him, even without the Byakugan active. Shino found himself somewhat uncomfortable under that gaze, which was another first. While he'd hoped Hinata would be able to coax Naruto out of his funk, he had no idea what passed between them while he and Kurenai dressed out the deer. Whatever transpired, it seemed to have had a significant effect on both of them. Naruto had revealed his secret to someone, probably for the first time, and it seemed to have galvanized the normally shy kunoichi. What are your conclusions? Hinata asked, snapping Shino's mind back to the present. I think you may be correct regarding his potential. With help, he may well become Hokage someday, Shino said. Hinata's eyes widened slightly, and then she nodded. With our help, she added. Shino computed the probabilities of him recovering consciousness yesterday before one of the kidnappers killed him. Without Naruto's presence, they were marginal at best. With our help, he agreed. Thank you, Shino-kun, Hinata said, smiling. Shino straightened his glasses. Konoha will prosper with a strong Hokage, he said. Ooh. Naruto felt almost giddy with relief as he sat down next to the fire. Shino and Hinata looked up as he and Kurenai returned, but Hinata just smiled and returned to her cooking while Shino did whatever he did behind that collar of his. I'm sorry I was acting like a jerk earlier, he said. Shino made a small noise that almost sounded like a snort. Anyo, Naruto, Hinata said as she carefully laid the hot skewers on the plates, we understand now. He smiled and scratched at the back of his head. It was a little uncomfortable, being around them after the conversations he'd had with Shino and Hinata. It was strange. He'd been dreading revealing his secret for so long, but once it was done, and nothing bad had happened, he still felt oddly exposed. He slowly began to relax as they ate. Hinata had outdone herself again. He didn't know how she'd managed to gather so many fresh greens to go with the rice and meat, but they added a nice touch. It wasn't ramen, but it was really good. Maybe she used her byakugan while they were patrolling. As they ate, Kurenai discussed their plans for the remaining 3 days of their assignment. They would need to keep an eye out for their relief, but any shinobi without a properly sealed scroll should be treated as potentially hostile. It was not unknown for an infiltration team to take advantage of the changing of the border guards. When they finished, Naruto jumped up to collect the plates. When he bent over to get Hinata's, he gave her a big smile. That was really good, Hinata-chan. While she blushed, for once Hinata didn't look away when he said something nice to her. Thank you, Naruto, she replied in a small voice. He gave Kurenai-sensei a big grin when he grabbed her utensils, which she returned with a raised eyebrow. Shino's plate still had a little rice left on it. You sure you ate enough for all those extra bugs? Naruto asked him in a worried voice. I don't want them chewing on me in the night if they get hungry. Shino made an exasperated sound. My allies receive more than adequate nourishment, Naruto. Furthermore, they are incapable of attacking humans in the absence of specific instructions from their host. The Aburame family has spent years breeding their Kikai bugs for absolute obedience, and there have been no fratricidal incidents since they were introduced. Shino's voice trailed off as Naruto's laughter could no longer be contained. Shino silently handed him his plate as Naruto got himself back under control again. Idiot, he said as Naruto turned to walk away. Naruto's laughter carried all the way back to the camp as he carried the dishes down to the stream. Ooh. The following day's patrol was fairly routine. The rock ninjas seemed just as reluctant to test their vigilance again, a fact that never failed to bring a smile to Naruto's lips. He wondered how badly they would freak out once he became Hokage. Thinking about why they feared the fourth Hokage wiped the smile from his face. As he leapt from tree to tree, he remembered his shock at thinking the fourth Hokage had killed people. Kurenai said that things seemed to have gotten more serious after one of his students was killed. Now he had at least some idea of what they'd been talking about. If he'd been willing to kill to protect his team, how would it be for the Hokage, who was supposed to protect the entire village? Would he be ready to do what was necessary to protect everyone? Would he even be able to live with himself if was forced to wage war to protect his people? Since the ambush, Naruto had fallen into the habit of keeping an eye on Hinata as they traveled through the trees. It only made sense, given that she was usually the first to sense danger with her eyes. But watching the Hyuga girl leap from branch to branch also supplied him with his answer. He remembered how relieved he'd been when he realized that Shino and Hinata were all right. Yes, he could do what was necessary to keep his precious people safe. As they were looping back toward camp, Hinata stopped suddenly. Naruto's hands were already forming seals as her head snapped to the side. She held one hand behind her back, with 3 fingers extended. Shino dropped silently to the ground and Naruto knew his bugs were already in motion. Hinata and Kurenai changed directions and leapt into a tree to the left of their original course. Naruto followed them, accelerating so he was able to land next to them when they touched down to confront the trio of interlopers. They wore the masks and hooded robes that just shouted, Anbu, to any resident of Konoha, but Naruto didn't relax at all. Kurenai said they needed to beware imposters, and she and Hinata would be right in the middle if a potential battle broke out. Can we help you? Kurenai asked coolly. Naruto noticed a couple of Kikai bugs pass by his feet, heading toward the intruders. We're your relief, the middle Anbu said in a bored tone, his voice slightly muffled by the boar mask. You're early, she observed. Hokage's orders, the Anbu replied laconically. Do you have proof? Kurenai asked. The boar-masked Anbu slowly pulled out a scroll tube and tossed it to the Jonin. Naruto blurred into motion, snatching the scroll out of the air and pivoting so his body was between it and his team. Hinata, he barked. The Anbu dropped into defensive stances as Naruto braced himself for an explosion or attack. It's all right, Hinata said quickly, her pale eyes glowing in the afternoon sunlight. Just paper and ink. No chakra. Naruto relaxed slightly, and handed the scroll to Kurenai. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw her closely examine the seal before breaking it and scanning the message. Suspicious little bastard, aren't you? The boar-masked Anbu asked in a conversational tone. But you'd do well not to startle us. Someone could have gotten hurt. It's authentic, Kurenai said after a moment. And it's probably not a good idea to startle us, either. She nodded her head toward the 30 or so Narutos dropping out of the trees behind the Anbu. We sense them, the crow-masked Anbu spoke up. It's a lot of bunshin, but they're hardly likely to distract us from you. Kurenai smiled sweetly as they turned to leave for their camp. Not bunshin, she corrected. Cage bunshin. One of the clones, smirking, smashed his fist into a tree, splintering the bark. The Anbu twitched at the sudden sound. Ooh, it only required a handful of minutes to break down the tents and pack up their equipment. Hinata left most of the meat and gathered greens for the Anbu to use, but Naruto made a special point of gathering the leftovers from Hinata's cooking. She blushed a little when he said that it was too good to leave for strangers. He was starting to get an idea of why she acted so weirdly when he complimented her, but he didn't like where his thoughts were taking him. So he left it alone for a while. Within the hour they were on the road back to Konoha. Naruto felt some of the tension flow out of his body as they left the borderlands. It would be good to return home, where hot showers and ramen could be found, the latter in large quantities. As he adjusted his heavy backpack, he glanced over at Hinata. She didn't seem to be as eager to return.